Here we go. All right, so Dr. Ford and Renee, take it away.
Yes, I am going to start sharing my screen theoretically. Can everybody see this?
I think we're good.
Yes.
Yeah, you can see this all?
Yes.
All right, good. Well, let's get going here. Well, first off, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. As Beth pointed out, I am an associate professor of public administration here at UW Oshkosh. Renee Christiansen is an MPA student here at UW Oshkosh and also a professional firefighter for the city of La Crosse. So we are both researchers and clients of local government. So a little bit about this project. First off, I want to thank the Tommy J. Thompson Center at UW-Madison for providing us a research grant that enabled us to get this project going. This work wouldn't have been possible without them. As the title of the research presentation suggests, we're really trying to understand where the local government workforce is in Wisconsin and where there might be disconnects between kind of what we're doing in MPA programs to teach the next generation, maybe what the public discussion is, and what local governments are actually facing and what they actually need. So there's a few phases to this project, and we're here to report on phase one, which is the results of a survey that we sent to every local government executive in Wisconsin, representing cities and villages, who had an available email address, and we emailed that survey to them. So we're dealing with municipal executives, the people that are actually in charge of managing the day-to-day operations of local government in Wisconsin. Our second phase, we're in the field right now, is a paper survey that we sent out to everyone who either didn't have an email address or did not respond to our original email survey. And we've done this in the past to different types of research, and we find that this dramatically increases the response rate. So keep that in mind here. Even though we have a good N of 99 responses, there's going to be more coming. In April, we have a dozen interviews that we're going to be conducting with municipal managers throughout Wisconsin. I think that'll be a nice way for us to expand a bit on the topics that we're talking about here. And then finally, the last phase, but probably the most important phase, is we'll be creating a document with some strategies that local government managers can adopt to try to improve the quality of the local government workforce in Wisconsin. But really, we're talking about the quality of outcomes, the ability for our local governments to meet the needs of the people they serve. So let's talk premise here. And by the way, in case if you weren't here at the beginning, Beth mentioned that you are free to ask questions along the way, raise your hand, what have you. Just go for that. So some background here. I mean, Wisconsin local governments employed, this is from the U.S. Census, 181,000 full-time employees in 2021. So this is a large and important sector in Wisconsin. And it's changing. Our workforce is changing. We're a decade into the largest human resource reform in Wisconsin history. And it's Wisconsin Act 10, the curtailing of public sector collective bargaining. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But that's now a new reality. That relationship between public sector employee and public sector manager has fundamentally changed. And I think it's crucial that we understand the way it's changed so that we can try to translate those changes into performance gains. We know the workforce is getting younger and less experienced in Wisconsin, as we'll talk about in a minute. Some of that is retirement, some of that is turnover, but nonetheless, it's a problem we can't afford to ignore. And then the need and demand for workforce diversity is growing. I know on the academic side of public administration, we talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some communities talk a lot about that in the practitioner arena, some don't. But the bottom line is we are, admitting a student here, the bottom line is that we are seeing increasing demands for a government workforce that looks and feels and represents diverse communities in Wisconsin. So we're trying to delve into all of these. And with that, I'll turn this over to Renee.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Ford. So this graph shows, oh, there we go. So this graph is from the Wisconsin retirement system, and it shows total losses of separation from the WRS system. So as you can see, look, 2011 in the black is total losses correlating really closely with the bottom, which is retirements, right? So that's the people that were of age to retire. Act 10 happened, and then they made the decision to, sorry, I think Dr. Ford, your screen got a little out of, there we go.
There we go. Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. So Act 10 happened, right? And those eligible personnel decided retirement, and those match up. But we're seeing something now that's a little bit different than has ever been seen in the past. This uptick that you see between 2020 and 2021 correlates directly with other separations, right? So for reasons other than retirement, people are leaving the WRS, the public sector in Wisconsin, and that's kind of the aim of this research, and kind of helped to develop these research questions for this project. We'll go to the next slide. So then looking at the research questions that this survey is hoping to dive into, it's how do these municipalities build management skills and incentive structures in this post-collective bargaining public sector world? How do you incentivize people to come and to stay? With that, how do municipalities address the staffing challenges that local government's facing? And then finally, how do municipalities recruit and retain a diverse workforce for local government, a workforce that reflects the diversity that exists in their communities?
All right, here we go. Apparently, I'm not very good at technology. That's disappointing. So we want to start with something really non-controversial, which is Wisconsin Act 10. If you can see that photo there, I chose that photo strategically. If you were around here in Wisconsin in 2011, you know that this was quite the political firestorm. If you weren't here, it's worth reflecting on what exactly Wisconsin's Act 10 did. It limited the scope of public sector collective bargaining to total base wages in the public sector workforce. Now, certain employees were exempt from these changes, public safety employees. It limited wage increases, so those things that could be bargained, to the rate of inflation. And then it eliminated the ability for governments to pay the employer share of health and retirement benefits for public employees. So it took something that used to be a very complex exercise, collective bargaining, and made it a very, very simple exercise, because there just wasn't much that could be collectively bargained after Wisconsin Act 10. I'd argue there were three basic aspects to Act 10. The first one was the financial, which I think was fairly obvious to everyone, that if you are passing on more of your benefit costs to your employees, meaning they have to pay a higher share, that's going to improve the bottom line of a municipality. So there were the financial aspects, but there were also these management changes, and we'll delve into that a little bit in the next few slides. But this redefining of the relationship between public sector employee and public sector manager, things that used to be collectively bargained, like working conditions, performance pay, et cetera, were no longer subject to collective bargaining. And I argue that created potential advantages, but also challenges. There was something to be said for not the simplicity, but at least the security of having a collectively bargained contract. You didn't have to necessarily build all those one-on-one relationships with all your employees and differentiate. Post Act 10, you had to. Things had changed, but we haven't really delved into these changes, in part because of the third part of Act 10, which was the political part. It's dominated the discussion. I think it's still, if you explicitly mention Act 10, it still kind of generates a visceral negative reaction in a lot of the public sector workforce. But I'd argue it doesn't negate the fact that we're still, right? It's still a different environment, a different paradigm right now. And one of the things we try to do at the Whitburn Center is meet challenges as they exist, not necessarily as we perhaps want them to exist. Real quick, some previous research. I've been studying this for 7 or 8 years, specifically the Act 10 stuff. So did a survey in 2016 of municipal officials. So the same sampling frame that we're working with now, municipal executives, the folks actually running the day-to-day operations of government. And the survey I did in 2016, it was obvious it was too soon. when I started asking about specific reforms, the municipal executives told me, they don't want to talk about this. My employees are still upset about this. We're struggling with this new world order. This is political. Even if you describe it as a human resource reform, we don't buy that. 2020 went back in the field and did some interviews with superintendents, so looking specifically at school districts. And this time things were a little bit different. The two main findings from that study is that there were a heck of a lot of reforms that were adopted by school districts after Act 10. A lot of them, again, nothing earth-shattering, but things like performance pay. That was the most common one. I think I found about 40% of school districts had adopted some type of performance pay they didn't have before. But there's also this more negative side on the management world related to employee free agency, that this incentives-based retrenchment, in other words, entrenchment, not retrenchment. In other words, people, when we did have widespread collective bargaining, people were incentivized to stay. Part of it was seniority and not wanting to give up their level of pay or their benefits or their preferential treatment for having the first crack at vacation time, all those things that can come with seniority. After Act 10, a lot of that went away, and we started seeing more movement within local government employment. And that's a challenge, especially for places that might be harder to staff, more out of the way, or maybe outside major metropolitan areas. So that's some of the background. Let me dig into the methods before I'll turn it over to Renee to dig into some of the results thus far. So as I mentioned in that first slide, we surveyed municipal executives all across Wisconsin, serving cities and villages. We got 99 usable responses, so people that finished every question on the survey, which was about a 20% response rate. You'll notice that we had a higher response rate among executives serving cities. And part of that is there is a decent number of villages that are very, very small in Wisconsin, have few, if any, employees outside of that administrator / clerk. And those were the folks that were least likely to respond. So I share that just because I want to give a little bit of a caution here that you shouldn't take these results and interpret them or apply them to very, very small municipalities, because that's really not who this sampling frame is. But who are the people we talk to? This is where I'll turn it over to Renee.
Yeah, so as you can see on the histogram, kind of as an average, the mean of the employees in these cities and villages was right around 63, 64 employees. With that, in all of those surveyed, approximately 2.7 open positions. What's important to note about that, you can obviously see on the graph that we have some outliers, very few municipalities with 600 employees, 400 employees, most of them falling into that range of 0 to 150. But the positions open correlated with the size of the municipality, right? So if you had a smaller municipality, it'd be closer to that, maybe one position. But then the range, as you can see, is kind of something worth noting. It was between 0 and, we lost our screen. There we go. 0% and 28.5%. So there was a municipality reported that had almost, between a quarter and a third of their staffed positions that were vacant at the time. So that's a pretty significant, there we go. We got it bigger. Perfect. That's a pretty significant number, and that's worth digging into. And this is one of those, measures that was found in the survey data that's going to be brought to the interviews, right? We need to talk to those people of, hey, a little over 25% of your positions are vacant. That probably needs some conversation to go along with it, right? Why are those positions open? And get a little bit more context. Is this you, Dr. Ford? Or is this
This is you, Renee.
This is me. Sorry. So I was like, I'm going to miss this slide that I'm supposed to do. So yeah, right. The attraction of public employee positions and retaining those employees. This is significant. If you look at these two metrics over the last 2 years, it has become more difficult to attract employees. These was 99 people surveyed, 4.2 on a scale of 1 to 5 Likert scale, 5 being highly agree, 1 being highly disagree. 4.2 is the aggregate that came up with these 99%. This is really difficult for these people are having a significant time attracting employees into these public sector positions, and they're having an equally difficult, a little less at 3.52 time retaining these employees. So why?
And that's where I'll jump in. As Renee said, we asked these questions on a Likert scale of 1 to 5. So the general rule of thumb here is look at that number of 3. If it's higher than 3, it means on balance, the municipal executives, so folks running the day-to-day operations of local governments in Wisconsin, they agree with these statements. Below 3, they disagree. Closer you get to 3, the more neutral you are. Now you don't have to take my methods class because I just walked through that. All right, so I bolded the ones that I think were most interesting here. And part of the reason I found these so interesting is that one of them is to be expected based on previous research, and one of them is changing. So wages, that's a really common reason that people cite in government about why it's challenging to try to hire somebody, right? We can't pay them enough. We can't compete with wages. But this competition from private sector employers at 4.30, that one struck me, and that's one that is significantly higher than it's been when I've asked these questions in the past. And certainly that can relate to the wages statement that maybe the private sector can afford to pay more. But what fascinates me is that it tracks with some of the numbers we're seeing in the WRS of people leaving the public sector, that we're not just in this world where we have a bunch of career public employees that are switching from public, maybe city to city, school district to school district. Folks are increasingly leaving for non-public sector jobs. And that's something we can't afford to ignore. The next set of questions, very similar. Next statements, same deal, ask on a scale 1 to 5, but talking about retention. How do you keep the people you have? When I teach, well, I guess I don't teach HR anymore, but the times I did teach HR, I always like to emphasize that one of the best ways to build a strong workforce is to keep the talent you have and keep them happy. So retention matters. And again, not unexpected, wages matters a great deal for keeping people around. But the competition from private sectors and other public sector employers is also something that folks agree with. The lack of advancement opportunities. And that's one I suspect we will see that's more of an issue for your smaller municipalities, where the only way to advance is to move on. We'll have the ability to model that when we pair all of our survey data with demographic data from the U.S. Census and fiscal data from the Department of Revenue here in the state of Wisconsin, because that's certainly something we want to understand, not just why people are leaving, but what are the patterns, because that'll help us better direct some of our policy and admin recommendations. So
Okay.
now, sorry, Renee, it's still me, but that's okay. Feel free to chime in. So trying to dig a little deeper into the types of reforms that folks were adopting. And we asked them, over the last 2 years, which of these reforms did you adopt? And we came up with this list based on previous research that I had done related to what local government was doing after Act 10, but also worked with a few of our MPA grads who also happen to be municipal managers to let us know what types of reforms we should be putting on here. That said, it's by no means inclusive, and that's one of the reasons it's by no means exhaustive. So that's one of the reasons we're doing interviews as well. But the one that struck me right here is the performance pay. Almost 30% of our municipal executives in this sample say that they've adopted some type of employee performance pay in the last 2 years. Similarly, the contracting out number really sticks out. 25% are contracting out previously in-house services. So again, not something they've always contracted out, because local government's always doing some type of contracting, but these are cities and villages that report that, yeah, we changed. There's something we used to do in-house and we're no longer doing it in-house. And I know you're probably thinking, isn't this about the government workforce? Well, I'd argue, yeah, it absolutely is, because those are services that used to be done by public employees that are no longer being done by public employees, but they're still being done. You still care about the quality. I think the other thing that sticks out on this slide is the COVID-related reforms. And this is an area where the interviews are going to have to give us some more detail, because things like flexible work schedules and telework, I think that we all know that some of this is driven by the COVID disruption. And it'll be fascinating and important to understand that this is something that's permanent In other words, are employees going to be expecting this flexibility? Are employers going to be able to provide this flexibility? Or is this something where we'll see some regression back to the mean pre-COVID? And now I'll turn it over to you, Renee, to talk about turnover.
All right, so employee turnover. So looking at the past 2 years, the percentage of staff that's been turned over at the municipalities surveyed, less than 10%, right around that half, but significantly higher is that number of 10 to 25%. So seeing a significant amount of turnover as compared to years prior. So looking at that further. Why are people leaving? Yeah, so this was kind of seven different metrics that the survey had, and you were just to rank them in order of reasons, 1 being the greatest reason, 7 being least important reason for turnover. So seeing retirements at the top, but I think that, those two leaving other public sector, right? Dr. Ford said going to a different school district or a different municipality, what have you. But really looking at that number 3 spot of employees just flat out leaving the public sector. Dr. Ford calls it, these public sector careerists. That's no longer maybe true in all cases, and people are in fact leaving for the private sector for one reason or another.
Well said, Renee. So again, because I can't help myself, if you haven't figured this out, I used to teach a class on Act 10 here at UWO as well. And yeah, Doug, I agree with Doug Gearon's comments in the comment section. That's interesting. We don't see movement to private sector on that last slide. And that is one of the things that, yeah, we're going to have to dig into in some of our interviews and see exactly what's going on there. And I'm guessing that part of this might be a regional effect too, where there's certain metropolitan regions where there's a lot of competition from the private sector, and maybe that's not the case in more rural areas. But again, I'm just speculating there, but there's certainly enough here to get us thinking along those lines. So looking at the elimination of collective bargaining again, this is a set of questions that I've asked different groups every 3 or 4 years, and it's pretty consistent over time. We see this statement here all the way to the left, asking folks to agree. Remember, above 3 means agreement. Do you think Act 10 strengthened the financial health of your municipality? And that was higher 5 years ago. I mentioned that 2016. Gosh, that was more than 5 years ago, wasn't it? That was higher in 2020, and that's starting to creep back down. And there's an open-ended response we'll share in a few slides that I think really tells a story there, that essentially passing some of those employee benefit and pension, or excuse me, health and retirement benefit costs onto the employee did have a short-term positive impact on local government finances, but that was more of a cow you only milk once, meaning that as time goes on, that becomes the new norm, and we're not necessarily seeing the cumulative impact. The other things that statements that were out there that were mostly about, has this made your job easier? Has it affected morale? Generally negative. So we're still in this kind of negative realm regarding Act 10, and we'll touch on that in a few minutes as well. But I want to move on to Renee here to talk a little bit about some of our surprising results, I think, related to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, so a couple questions relating directly to this idea of a full-time DEI coordinator. Of the 99 responses, 100% of the municipalities do not have somebody in that role, and they have no plans to hire somebody. We do know of cities in the state of Wisconsin, municipalities in the state of Wisconsin that do have someone serving in this position, but they're obviously the outliers, and that's worth further discussion. So looking at DEI as a whole lot of neutral to negative. So what Dr. Ford means by that is you can see the mean of all these questions. If you're reading, these were statement questions of, strongly agree to strongly disagree. Everybody's just kind of hovering in the middle of like not really having an opinion or not having a strong opinion. You see our municipalities currently in the process of adopting initiatives to their likely temporary responses, which those questions, the bottom 2 questions, are interesting because seeing the neutrals in the top 5 questions about, DEI initiatives improve government performance. Well, not really the opinion of the people that have answered our survey. However, they also aren't answering that they think DEI efforts have a negative impact on government functions, right? DEI initiatives are a distraction from the core duties of government, 2.66. So they're disagreeing with that as well. So there's this interesting conversation of, well, we don't think it's at the top of the priority list, but we don't think it shouldn't be on the list. So that's kind of a interesting and confusing measure. And that will be definitely questions in that interview time that hopefully we can delve further into the whys and maybe some context of the feelings of some of these officials.
Yeah, well said, Renee. Yeah, I go back to, if folks know, there's a researcher, her name's Susan Gooden, but she did her dissertation on, I believe, the Milwaukee County Health Department. So she has some Wisconsin connections, and she wrote a book about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and she called it the nervous area of government. And her whole like thesis was that it's an area we're not quite sure how to talk about it or what we should be doing with it. And the response for a lot of local government employees or public employees in general, public sector managers in general, is to just try not to talk about it too much because we're afraid of saying the wrong thing or don't quite get what people mean when they say diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as Chris just said in the meeting chat, then yeah, these agencies may struggle to attract a diverse workforce. And we'll share some open-ended questions now that I think will really get at that point, Chris, because I do think we could get a little bit of nuance here through these open-ended questions. So these were also questions, and these are all quotes, and these are all things that we asked via the survey, but we gave the survey respondent the opportunity to basically speak off the cuff. So I'll let Renee take this slide to talk about some of the barriers that folks reported to attracting employees.
So kind of the 3 main areas, Dr. Ford had kind of consolidated these nicely from all of their open-ended responses. So housing and community size, right? Like people can't move to some of these municipalities despite there being maybe jobs that they're qualified for or interested in because they can't afford to live there. We kind of talked about in a discussion, we've taken the example in Wisconsin of just the Door County Peninsula as a whole. Cost of living is extremely disproportionate to other areas of Wisconsin. So you're asking maybe somebody coming straight out of college or with a family can't afford to live where they want to work. So how would I even apply to that job? So the inability to secure affordable housing, right? Kind of going off of that, and just lack of housing altogether. Culture, we say increase public welfare benefits and programs in kind of an informal way. It seemed like the response was, well, people don't want to work. That's just kind of the nature of the world we live in these days. There's all these free benefits. Why would they go do all this hard work when they don't have to? And then this lack of respect for public servants and the career field of public sector as a whole.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? And the culture stuff gets me because some of those things, right, we're trying to focus, and we will on our final report, what are the things that local governments can actually control? Because we want to make sure we give something actionable out of this, but we still have to pay attention to the fact that there are just national issues, whether they're culture issues or national political issues that are bleeding into some of the things happening in local government related to the workforce. So we had this catch-all at the end of this survey. What else do we want to know? And what was really cool, what I always like including that in a survey, is that you tend to figure out what questions bothered people, or what questions people wish you would have asked, which helps when you go into the survey or to the interview phase. A lot of people had a lot of things to say about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it runs the gamut, right? That first one, that quote there, we're in northern Wisconsin, we don't do DEI here. I mean, that was a pretty common response, that basically that we're not a diverse community, and that's just not something that we're dealing with here. Okay, fair enough. I think maybe the middle of the road answer that was also very common was that, we care about DEI, we care about diversity, equity, inclusion. We want to attract the best workforce that we can, but we have to understand that at times, as that individual put down here, I just need a live body. And I just keep thinking of that one municipality that had, 28% of their positions vacant. It's got to be hard for them to start worrying about some of these issues when they can't get anybody to move there or to staff them. And then perhaps maybe I was a little disheartened by this. Anytime someone kind of gets mad about taking a survey, I get disheartened. But there were some folks that were just out, they were just hostile and were like, why are you asking about diversity, equity, inclusion? The second one, right? There's more important issues in the state of Wisconsin than this. I didn't include the one. The one was really personal. It was like, you're lucky you have a job when you're asking about this stuff. You shouldn't have a job. You should be fired for talking about these things. I said, oh my goodness, that's not good. I got to feed my kids. That last one there was also fairly hostile, that this, DEI programs are diverse and bigoted. We think it's hypocritical. So that's not something that's on our radar screen. So a lot going on there. The people that felt compelled to talk about Act 10, I think were fairly representative of what we saw in our survey. I already mentioned that second bullet point when I was presenting the quantitative survey results, that yeah, we saw some cost savings initially, but as time went on, it just hasn't followed, right? It just hasn't been a long-term positive fiscal gain. And then there's still folks that they hear Act 10 and they just say, that this helps, contribute to the demonization of public employees in Wisconsin. And we think this is having an effect on who wants to teach, work, and serve here. And this is perhaps my favorite as a local elected official serving a community that has a city manager, and it's role confusion. In other words, respondents were saying that one of the major factors that's driving people away from our municipality, people that don't want to work here, is that we have elected officials that don't know their role, don't understand their form of government, and are overstepping their bounds and basically making life difficult for our employees. And we're getting a reputation. People don't want to be here. We're getting a reputation as a city that doesn't work. So a quick plug here, some previous work we did at the Whitburn Center, our governance toolkit is designed to get out at exactly this problem, where you have a governing board that doesn't understand their role, their authority, or how to manage their deliberations. And Christy had asked if it's possible to get a report of the finding of the survey. And yes, I will definitely, we can post that on the Whitburn Center website. And if you put your email, or we should have your email because you signed up for this, I can certainly email you those survey results as well, and keep you posted as more survey results come on in. But keeping going here, this quote, I think, really summed up all of our results. Someone responded, someone much wiser than me, that we have lost momentum to create long-term civil servants. And, I admit, I love data. I start digging into the specifics. Sometimes you miss the forest from the trees. And I think that this individual had a really good way of cutting through all that stuff, right? We've lost the momentum to create long-term civil servants in Wisconsin. And I like this framing. But one, I think it's accurate. I think it ties into so much of what we've seen in the public sector in Wisconsin. I keep toying with the idea of writing a book called Atrophy, which is really about Wisconsin government and how we've frozen in time a little bit in 2004. And that applies to the way we finance local government. That applies to some of our service delivery mechanisms, and certainly applies to our HR practices. So our framing here, which thank you to that survey respondent for helping us set it up, is when we pivot to our solutions mode here, is we want to dig into how we can regain the momentum for a local government workforce that's really trained in those values that we at least preach in our MPA programs as sacred, right? A local government workforce that cares about performance, cares about efficiencies, cares about equity, right? We want a local government that gets the job done, that does it with keeping in mind the burden placed on the local taxpayer, and does it in a way that ensures fairness in delivery of public services to make sure that in a democratic governance regime that we're serving everybody. If we're not serving everybody, we're really not fulfilling our promise of democratic governance. So specifically, Renee and I had some back and forth about how we're going to approach this next phase, and I'd love to hear from anybody else that has comments on these results thus far or on these ideas. But I think we need to close the door on Act 10. And the reason I say that, and maybe that's part of the Whitburn Center ethos, is that we have to try to approach reality as it exists. And the history is important. The road that we got here can't be ignored. But from a strictly management perspective, almost 30% of our local government executives that took this survey say that they've adopted performance pay in the last 2 years. I want to know how they're doing that. What does it look like? Is it working? Right? We need to have a better understanding of employee free agency. If we know that folks are having, a whole bunch of pressure from the public and private sector now for attracting and retaining employees, we need to dig into that a little more and understand why people are leaving. Contracting out. So much of the research in our little corner of the world around contracting deals with things like, how do you manage the procurement process? How do you ensure that you're not wasting money? A lot of it's financial. I think we need to pivot a little bit and talk about performance and how do we ensure that we can keep those core values of efficiency, effectiveness, and equity in a governing environment that is increasingly reliant on non-public entities. And then certainly we have to delve into the ins and outs of work flexibility and see if that's a permanent part of the local government workforce, because if it is, we better work on developing policies, trainings, and things that are specific to working in this more virtual and flexible environment, because it's different. Wages, advancement, and training. The wages, that's almost refreshing to me, because it's like, if wages are the problem, that's a problem I know how to solve. Just give me more money, right? If we have more money, we can pay people more. But there's more to it than that, right? If we're competing with the private sector, we don't have the luxury of assuming kind of that old belief that, hey, people are attracted to the public sector because they know it's less money, but they're just publicly service minded. Well, if we're contracting out more, it makes sense that more people are going to the private sector, because you can have a job that is public service oriented, but not part of the public sector. And local governments have to compete with that. And as Jesse just said, yeah, organizational culture. I mean, that's a huge one as well. And that needs to be considered. And that's definitely something, Jesse, that we're going to ask about in our interviews. Because there are some decent survey instruments out there trying to measure organizational culture, but I think they're all kind of out of date. But you're absolutely right. If you can get a better quality of life, or to go back to some of those open-ended responses about people saying that, hey, I don't need to be in this public sector because I got a bunch of elected officials and members of the community yelling at me. I can go be in a culture where I feel valued. That's going to matter. More flexibility in wage setting and rethinking traditional advancement. Again, I'm as guilty as anyone of maybe talking a little too much about how it's a myth to say that we can just run government like a business. But that doesn't mean we can't learn certain things from the private sector. And more importantly, I think we kind of have to if we're competing with them. We can't afford not to. Doesn't mean we have to adopt all these public or private sector ideas, but it does mean that if we're competing with them, we have to understand them. When it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we got to talk about it differently. I just think that when we view diversity, equity, and inclusion from the lens of culture wars, in other words, a political lens, and I think we're doing that more and more. And we're seeing that in certain states like Florida, where they're all in on it. We're seeing that here in Wisconsin, where certain agencies are passing edicts that we can't even use the word equity because it's code for something else. It's code for a whole litany of political beliefs. And again, wherever people are on cultural issues, that's really not the point here. The point here is that if we want to have a government sector that has any credibility, it needs to have credibility with diverse communities. And if DEI, as it's currently discussed and implemented, isn't doing that, we got to figure out why and figure out how we address that. And the coordinator issue is one thing that I go to right off the bat. And I say this I admit I'm terribly biased by my own experience working as an elected official for the city of Oshkosh. Like, we spend a lot of time talking about, do we need a DEI director? Do we not need a DEI director? What does that mean? And maybe we're a little ahead of ourselves, in at least statewide, in that discussion, that we need to talk about the concepts and demystify what is really meant by fairness in the delivery of public services, and recognize that that's not the same thing as, people hear that sometimes they think affirmative action or something that really gets people fired up. We got to demystify it and perhaps make it a little less controversial. And I know Dr. Sam Larson isn't here, but she is a national expert on this stuff, and she has an unbelievable ability to explain some of these DEI concepts in a way that are not threatening, but are meant to enhance communities. And that, tying into that, is we have to have more research on what is that link between DEI initiatives and performance, because that's as important as well. These are good, bad, or ugly. We need to know if they work. And then, for my personal corner of the world, rethinking a little bit about how we educate future members of the public sector. And especially given that a lot of our students now are not going to end up in the public sector. You can have a fruitful career in public service outside the public sector. And that means we got to rethink some of our traditional norms and modes of teaching, because not everyone that goes and gets an MPA or gets a degree that is, qualifies you to teach as a credential or not to teach, to serve in the public sector. It doesn't mean they're going to be entering a rules-driven bureaucracy. They might be doing something else, and we have to, I think, lean into that. How to do that? More micro-credentialing, maybe moving past the heavy hammer of an emphasis, like in our program. Are you a nonprofit person? Or are you a public sector person? Got to separate you. No, right? You can be one and the same. You overlap. Maybe it's a specific skill, an MPA with a GIS credential attached to it, or an MPA with a human resource credential attached to it. There's a lot of movement there that we can do at UWO, but I think can be done throughout the UW system to help get that next generation of public sector employees ready. And finally, this ties into what I previously said, but a foundation built on the reality of publicness. And what I mean by that is just the blurring of the public, nonprofit, and private sectors. Right? We're training people to serve. We're not training people to serve in one specific sector or one specific agency. There's many ways to do that. And as Christy pointed out in the chat, and that's a really good point. What about folks that move from the local to state government level? I mean, that's a problem too. Now, I'll say, Christy, for this, it's not a problem, but it's something we need to dig into. For this research, we are specifically looking at the local government workforce, but I'm hoping that in the future we can look at the state government workforce too, because you're right, we're lying to ourselves if we assume that folks enter, just like we're lying to ourselves if we assume folks enter the public sector and never leave. People move from state to local all the time, and that can require different skill sets. It's a different political environment. We got to talk about that. Yeah, you should ask what matters to you, Christy. And Jesse, as you said in the chat, right? Flexible work schedules, leveraging technology, and a broader conversation about public goods. I think you're right on the mark there, especially that last one with a broader conversation about public goods. We can't afford to have our training for the public sector workforce or our wage systems and our professional development activities tied to a public sector that no longer exists, or a understanding of public goods that no longer exists. And that gets back to that atrophy concept that the world is changing, the public sector is changing, and we have to make sure that we're providing the human capital that's ready for those changes. So I'll get off my high horse here now, and we can open it up to questions, but thank you so much. We'll be collecting more data. We'll be matching with hard data, as I mentioned, and doing interviews, and really excited to see where this goes next. So I can stop sharing here, and we can open it up to any further questions or comments. And Renee, if you have anything you'd like to add to finish up, please Please do. See, poor Renee's a student of mine, so she's used to having to listen to me ramble on. Peggy, could I pick on you a little bit? Ask you to tell me what you mean by that?
Sure. I think, people right away gravitate in Wisconsin and saying we don't have a diverse workforce, we don't have, and they look at it through mostly a racial lens, oftentimes. And because of this, the inclusion piece on how you really do include people, how you onboard people, how you bring people into the workforce and show them the ropes, whatever that might mean. And then the culture, some are diverse. When we talk about diverse persons, the workforce has been set up for white males, and even women struggle. That's been statistically shown for years and years in our workforce of how women struggle even in the workforce. So you could even look at women as the diverse population and how they move through, the government workforce as well. And so when you start looking at that, how are people really actually included in their day-to-day work and job really has to be really understood. Even the talk, the tone, the tenor, the microaggressions that happen all the time aren't even discussed, and I haven't even seen in some of the materials that you've just shown, other than people have really kind of weird attitudes that I never really imagined.
Oh, great comments, Peggy. And I think that gets at the comment that I believe Jesse made in the chat about organizational culture. If you didn't have a chance, and this goes to all of you, if you didn't get a chance to attend our Women in Government Wednesday event, we had a fabulous panel that really did dive into some of those issues, specifically around gender. And that's worth checking out, because you're absolutely correct, Peggy. And I think that's an area that everyone can. Right, gender equity. I think that's pretty non-threatening too. I mean, that's easy to get your head around. But good stuff. Doug, do you want to expand a little bit?
Sure. A lot going on there as I was listening. Working in county government for many years. I worked in city government for the city of Milwaukee for 11 years, and now I've been in Winnebago County government for about 19. And the changes that we've seen over the years. I mean, obviously the DEI is has been a big distraction, a big issue that has been more divisive than uniting, that's for sure. I agree that we've got to find a better way to talk about it. We've seen just extraordinary politicalization of issues. Clearly the pandemic was one, where we're making viewpoints based on politics rather than, what's actually, perhaps good for our populations. I think we've really seen in recent years people running for local office based on, a singular issue rather than a desire to serve. And, coming back to, that our elected officials and our employees in local and state governments are servants, are public servants. I mean, we're really here to serve the population, not to drive a political agenda. And we could probably do a better job of orientating our elected officials on that when they start. And I think we've tried to do some of that. That doesn't help when people are campaigning, of course, right? That only happens once they're in office. And I guess maybe just to touch on the other issues. I mean, I was really surprised to see in those early slides the private sector competition or losing staff to private sector. And one of the things that I've always been really conscious of is when government competes with the private sector. if there are services that belong, that are in the private sector, why do we even have them in the public sector? And so is it a talent issue? Is it a skill set issue, that the private sector, benefits from public sector experience? Or is it a service delivery piece? What we have to re-examine what we're doing. If private sector is doing something, then, and we need it, then we should probably be contracting it out. We shouldn't really be competing, with them. And then, the whole compensation piece, you outlined very well, in this presentation, some of the factors that have led to that. I wish, it was easy as how it's feeling recently, that all of a sudden now there's a bunch of money, at least short term, to try to help fix this. But this has been an issue for, many years now, where local governments are just scraping to get by and trying to figure out their budgets, and that the biggest cost is labor. And the result of that has been, lots of wage freezes that have occurred over time, and you start to lose, those that have that option to go somewhere else, or some of your strongest talent, they leave. And we've reached multiple pain points, I think, in the staff that we have, the ability to recruit quality staff, because of wages. And we've certainly, are now at a point where we've struggled to retain good staff as well, which has made things a lot worse. So I'm happy to see that there's, a discussion of, increasing shared revenue again, and, appreciating that local governments need, a certain amount of money to operate. But we also have to, be as efficient as we can, with the funds that we have. I would love to see, public sector positions actually be, desirable positions where we actually have competition for them. We're at a point now where we have the most vacancies that we've ever had. Winnebago County, 900 plus employees, nearly 10% of those positions are vacant. And we are getting very few applicants. We've had a nurse position open for a month. I think we've had 2 applicants for it. We're just not seeing applications. We recruited for a communicable disease supervisor, and we had 1 application in 6 weeks. We're just not seeing the interest in working for local government, and our image has suffered. Yeah.
No, I think you nailed that, Doug. And I think that's a common refrain we're hearing. And to get at the funding and the wage issue, because Jesse brought that up too, we got to do another plug here for the Whitburn Center. But we were part of a group. I printed out the report, proud of it. It's called Renewing a Sustainable and Equitable State and Local Government Funding Partnership. So we partnered with the UW Extension, the Local Government Institute, and we had representatives from the League of Municipalities, the Towns Association, the Counties Association, and we really dug into the shared revenue problem and came out with a recommendation to in support of the 1%, dedicating 1 cent of the 5% sales tax in the state to shared revenue. And thankfully, we're pleased that it was something that the governor put in his State of the State address, and that the Republican legislature has also indicated support for in concept. Now, budget season, who knows what will happen? But it certainly is a moment of hope that there's going to be some relief there that will hopefully aid local governments in having some more funding available for things like wages, because they have been struggling. Any other comments? We're up against it. I'm happy to hang around. I do want to say, Ruth, that thank you. I really appreciate that comment, especially since Ruth works for the Tommy Thompson Center, and they were the ones that made this research possible. But that fits into the whole concept of the Whitburn Center, why we funded it, is that we wanted to be we're a research center, but we didn't want to be a think tank that just put out ideas that, right, like I called them butterflies and rainbows. Everybody loves butterflies and rainbows, but sometimes you have cloudy days, right? You got to make the most of it. We want to approach problems as they exist. And we really do believe that finding new and innovative ways to improve the competence of the local government workforce is the foundation that will increase trust in government and ultimately, hopefully, have an influence up onto higher levels of government, showing we can still govern here in this state. Anything else, Renee, that you'd like to add?
No, just thank everybody for being here, and hope you took away some good nuggets.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Like I said, if people have other comments or questions, I'm happy to hang around. I don't want to speak for you, Renee, because we only told you until 1 o'clock, but let us know.